Welcome to Motivated to Lead podcast, helping you become a better leader. I'm your host, Mark Klingsheim. Hi, everyone. Mark Klingsheim with SEMA Partners. Glad you could join us for our podcast. Each week we interview leaders, and this week we're going to be talking with Jeannine Sheehan. She is the Chief Administrative Officer and HR Officer for InfuSystem, and previous she was the Chief Human Resource Officer for Crimson Hexagon. She's worked in large publicly traded companies as well as VC-funded startups. Looking forward to our conversation with Jeannine. Well, it's good to have everybody joining us this week for our podcast, and we have Jeannine Sheehan that's joining us, and it's good to have you with us today. And I guess first off, Jeannine, can you give us just a little bit of your background and your career, a little bit of your history?
Happily. Thanks for having me, Mark. So I will start with where I am today, and then I'll start over and share some of my early journeys with you.
Sure.
So I just started. Actually, I'm in week 4 at a medical device company called InfuSystem. And I am in the capacity of Chief Administrative Officer. And it's pretty cool because part of what we're talking about today is the journey and the career path and how people get to where they are. And so this will be certainly leading the HR function, which I know is the broader part of your audience for this particular podcast. But it also will dovetail into broader work, which is really fun. So things like mergers and acquisitions and board work, which is always really cool, particularly for CHRO. So where I started is interesting. Right out of school, I started at Accenture, which used to be Anderson Consulting, and I started in an administrative capacity. And then I followed that to Digitas, formerly Bronner Schlossberg. And I have to say, starting my career in an administrative capacity was extremely beneficial because it serves me even today. So being able to, whip your way around Microsoft products, whether it's PowerPoint, Word, Excel, and just having those administrative skills is a huge value add. And it also opened a lot of doors for me too, because the executives that I supported at the time saw a lot of the potential that I had just by some of the work that I did. So that's how I started my career. And when I was in my final administrative assistant position, I supported human resources. And I got my first generalist position, worked my way up, and then went to larger companies. And then I took a completely radical shift. So I had worked at large publicly traded companies. And then I looked back, I had enrolled in business school, and I was ready to make a change. And I said, okay, what is something that I've never done? So I've worked at large publicly traded companies as middle line manager, director.
Sure.
And I had seen companies go public. I had seen them go private, had helped in that process. But what I hadn't done is I hadn't worked for a private equity or VC-backed company that was just going through their series, say C, and in hypergrowth. And so that was the job that I just recently had with a company called Crimson Hexagon. They were still are PE-backed company, around 45 million in revenues, very high growth plans, funded by multiple sets of investors. And they had just finished their Series C when I joined. So I'll pause there for a minute and make sure I'm answering your question as I
absolutely
going.
So one of the questions we ask every executive that we interview is, knowing what you know now and looking back on your career, is there anything particular that you would tell your 22-year-old self if you could go back in time? And what advice would you give?
I would say this might sound a little, I don't know, it's okay to start at the bottom and work your way up, and that you shouldn't underestimate the value of the skill set you learn starting at a very junior position and working your way up. And I know that's hard today because we have so many tools at our disposal, and in fairness, the curve is faster now. And with that goes expectations. But I think it's fair to say that there's a lot of power and value that comes in those tools that you learn in positions that are more junior than what you feel you may be ready for.
So going back to you've had large company experience. Tell me a little bit as far as that transition to more of a startup VC funded type organization. What things would you
Yeah.
tell somebody about that transition, and what advice would you give somebody in that move?
Yeah, so there's a lot there. I mean, the quick of it would be that when you come from a large company, public or private, there are processes in place, whether it's people processes, systems, procurement, finance and accounting. Their processes are very much established, especially if it's a seasoned company. When you go to a smaller entrepreneurial company, particularly those that are in early stages, even late stage companies that are founding CEOs, they wouldn't have survived in their entrepreneurial stage if they did have a ton of process and a ton of political tape, as you will. And yet your job is to come into that company. The reason they go after someone that has that large company experience and bring them in is they want you to take that experience and help this company grow. They want you to put processes and procedures in place. And you have to be careful how you do it, because you don't want to break the culture. You don't want to kill that sort of entrepreneurial spirit and zest, but at the same time, you've got to put a code of conduct in. Or, drinking beer at your desk at 2:00 is just not a good idea when you are experiencing, say, volatility in the market or whatever.
Sure.
Business is in a downturn. So the balance of it is that you have to find a way to do that in a way that is efficient and doesn't take too long, but that's authentic and takes the culture with it versus kind of breaks it and tears it apart.
Got it. Tell me about your thoughts around the HR role being a strategic partner. I think years ago, HR was considered something that wasn't really at the table, but today that's changed. Mm-hmm. Tell me a little bit about your thoughts and your experience around that.
Yeah, so I have very strong opinions. Anyone that listens to this that knows me knows how I feel about that topic, so thank you for raising it. It's interesting. I was in HR. I had just started in HR back when it was more that personnel function, highly transactional, very rarely seat at the table. The HR EVP would report into the CAO or CFO or the president. Today it's different, and we've earned our seat at the table, and you have to continue to add value, and you have to continue to show up. To me, what I see, and I think this is how I ended up in this role that I'm in now as CAO, is it's so much more than just owning the people function. It's making sure that the employees understand how the work that they do ties to business outcomes, and how does that happen. So it doesn't matter what their role is, it doesn't matter what their rank is in an organization, whether it's indirect or direct, everybody, the contribution that they make and the value that they create should somehow tie to how the business is performing or not performing. And so the strategic role in HR, in my opinion, is really helping thread that needle and helping the employees understand where that value creation is. And then the other part of it, the more simple part of it, in concept at least, is when I'm at the table, I don't just talk about people topics. I'm asking questions on the P&L. I understand how to read a balance sheet. I'm asking questions in areas of the business that I don't really need to. And I feel that as a business partner, which everyone on this call will relate to, how am I going to do a good job supporting the sales organization or the go-to-market strategy, or the product roadmap if I don't understand what it is they're doing? So part of it is really understanding the company and how it works, and it really sets you off for much greater success as a business partner too, because you get how the company works.
So is that an education process? Some companies are further along in that thought process, and how do you influence that?
That's a tough one, because there are still a lot of organizations that look at the people function in sort of, and I don't really like to use the word old school, but they look at it in more of an archaic way. So to me, the most important thing is when a company decides to hire a CHRO, that's usually a good indication that they're ready. I would say the key is you've got to have a strong team. There's no longer any room for B or C players. You've got to have an A team, and the leaner your team, the higher they've got to be in terms of their competency. And you've got to have people that are curious, because what will happen is if you've got that intellectual curiosity in your team, and you've got that competency, it becomes a little more organic, so that you're not at the table saying, well, why wouldn't you want to invite me to more than just the ceremony? I want to go to the reception. So to me, that value and that transition that you just talked about, unfortunately, it can't be deliberate. It's got to just be in the organization seeing what you're doing. And then hopefully the invitation comes, and if it doesn't, then you're at the wrong party.
Well, Jeannine, can you give us some of your thoughts around inclusion and some of the teachings and learnings that you've had at Cornell?
And the lessons that I learned on that were at Cornell through Professor Lisa Nietzsche. And the concept there that I feel very acutely, I feel it myself, even in the current organization where there's room to grow, is that there's this idea that companies still focus so much today on diversity and checking the box and the sociodemographics, or making sure that they go after a certain population in the workforce that either makes them look better or makes them feel like they're hitting all the D&I check boxes. And so what I've learned both through my coursework, but also in my own experiences, is that the I is vastly missing still in many organizations. And it's nobody's fault necessarily. It's these biases that we all hold, where we hire people that look like us, that act like us, that behave like us, that talk like us, have the same type of profile that we have common interests. And the problem there is that if you go and hire people that have that, or you try to check a box and hire people that are different than that because you want to be a diverse company, then you don't pull through on the inclusion side. And so what that means is that the only way people can succeed is if they're not themselves. So I can only last in my department if I change who I am to be able to fit in with my boss, or I change my style of working so that my boss can appreciate the work that I'm doing. And that's that inclusion piece that I had mentioned the other day that I feel is still greatly lacking. And it doesn't matter how much D&I work you do, you can go hire a D&I consultant. If you don't focus on the I and on the inclusion and making sure that people can shine and thrive and that their brains light up just by being who they are, and all that front end work you've done is just wasted work. And then you end up losing people, and they leave really upset because you've not been honest with them through the process.
Well, Jeannine, one of the questions that has been posed for a number of years is around being a woman in business and the barriers that are there. Do you think the barriers are still there today?
It's a great question, and it actually is a great dovetail from the diversity and inclusion questions. I do, and it's interesting. I remember about a year ago listening to a podcast, actually, on this very topic. And, I've read all the Sheryl Sandberg books. I've always been an avid believer in pushing through that ceiling. And there was a time when I thought, okay, well, we're perpetuating the problem by talking about it. But you know what? I don't think that's true. I've seen a lot in the last 6 months, in particular, at the companies I've been at, my prior company and this company that I'm at today, where I still see that happening. I still see, whether it's a board meeting, whether it's an executive meeting, I still see that either I observe it or at times I feel it myself, where I have to be a little more vocal than, say, my counterpart in expressing an opinion or being asked for my opinion. And so I would tell you that I think some companies do a better job on it, particularly if they focus on it. So, for example, there are companies that specifically go after, female board members because they have a highly male-dominated board. But if I go back to that inclusion piece, if they don't do a good enough job ensuring that that person that joins can succeed, then it doesn't work. So yes, I do think that there are still barriers. I still feel them, although I don't feel them as acutely as I think the generation before us probably did.
Tell me a little bit as far as you're staying current in your role and continuing to learn and develop. Are there any books that you've read lately or in the past that you think would be great resources for people listening to the podcast?
There are. So, but to answer the first question, I think it's an important one. When I went back for my executive master's, that's part of the reason why I did it, Mark, was because I felt like I was flat. I felt like I wasn't learning a lot of on-the-job learning, but I was losing that intellectual curiosity for myself. So that's part of the reason why I went back to school. I would encourage people, especially emerging leaders, when it feels like you're at your busiest and it's the last time you'd want to go back to school or pick up a book or go to a seminar, join, HRLF or SHRM or another network, NARA. There's plenty of them. Mm-hmm. That's the time when you should do it. That's the time when you should stoke that curiosity. As far as books, there's one, I've read many of them. I don't have as many as you have in your bookshelf, Mark. But my favorite is Fierce by Susan Scott. And I think she started the company out of Portland. And it is now an instructor-led series. You can get certified on it as well. And it's all about coming up from behind yourself and making the conversation real. And being able to, whether it's conflict mastery, whether it's personal or professional challenges you have, it's all about the relationship and that every conversation you have counts. So Susan Scott, Fierce, and again, they've got an amazing learning program too that you can bring into your organization.
Join us next week for part 2 of our conversation with Jeannine Sheehan as we talk about the war for talent and how to improve your processes to make better hiring decisions. Thank you for listening to the Motivated to Lead podcast. Please subscribe on iTunes. You can also see a video version of this interview at motivatedtolead.com. This podcast is brought to you by SEMA Partners, helping you find your next great leader.